Okay, welcome back. So we finished off here and we've got a big problem with our glossy reflections. So without doing anything else first, let's just sort that out. So let's come up here to glossy reflection, and there's too much of it. So let's turn it down to maybe 0.075, and also it's too sharp. So let's turn the roughness up to, let's say, 0.6. Let's try. Okay, and now we need to render. So I'm going to kidnap this and just hit render. Okay, so that's immediately looking a lot better on the spec light. There's a much better, more skin-like highlight that we've got going on. And because of the spec map we painted, we're not getting much spec in between the gaps of the little lizard skin here. So it helps to more clearly define the skin as well, which is nice. But I'm still not quite satisfied with this. I'd need to generate a viewport preview, but I'm not going to bother right now. Sometimes the preview just falls off, so you can always go back in and hit generate preview. But again, I find most of the time, I'm sure they'll sort this out in 2017. But for now, most of the time I can live without a preview in the viewport. But if you do want it back, you can just go, as I've said before, and hit that generate preview. Now, if I look at my front diffuse reflection, I wanted to lighten it up a bit, and we did lighten it up a bit by just turning the color offset up a bit. We also have a new exposure, so I'm going to crank the exposure up a bit as well, just to get that texture a bit whiter. So let me just check I'm actually editing the right one, because right now I'm not sure. Okay, so we want the exposure under the diffuse reflection. And yeah, I'm going to go for 1.3. And you can see in the little tile preview, this just whitens it up and saturates it. This will allow more of the color from the underneath SSS layer to come through. So if I just, instead of talking you through it, if I just render it and flick backwards and forwards, you'll see a slight difference. Okay, now you should notice that by creating that exposure, that overexposure on the diffuse reflection, we've lightened the whole guy up quite a bit. Now, normally I would do that in Photoshop, so I would take the color texture and just lighten it up a bit in Photoshop, maybe knock out a bit of the detail with some blur. But for right now, for this particular character, because we just want it a bit lighter, we can just use that exposure node in Maya, but it is generally preferable just to lighten up a bit in Photoshop. But in this case, we can get away with just doing it this way. Right, so right now, the main body of our character is looking pretty good. It's under fairly harsh lighting conditions, so it could probably be tweaked, but for right now, this is good enough. I just want to move on to the eyes, the teeth, and the horns. So as I'm going to do the teeth and the horns and the inside of the mouth in a similar material, I'm going to grab them all together like so and just assign new material. I'm going to use pretty much exclusively the Mila material for this, and I'm going to add a weighted layer, and this time I'm going to add a diffuse reflection. I'm going to have a weight of 1, so 100%, and I'm just going to add in our color. So let's go up and let's put in our color, which in our case is this green one. UV tiling mode of Mari and generate preview, which should show us that the spikes and the inside of the mouth take the texture that we made in Mari. There we go. So that's that bit done. I'm going to come in and hide these eye caps because I want to see the eye underneath. Then I'm going to select both eyes. I'm going to assign them a new material too. So another Mila material. I'm going to add a weighted layer and again just diffuse and give this the eye color, which again will be in our main color file. So there we go. And once again, we'll have to tell it Mari, and I can generate a preview for the viewport just to make sure everything is working. And there you go, both of my eyes should have come in. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole thing with the texture on it. Let's give him a quick render and see what he looks like with eyes. So let's kidnap this one and hit render. Okay, so there we go. We've got eyes, teeth and horns along here. Now these are just diffuse reflective materials. So they're only going to show the diffuse contribution. There's going to be no reflection other than the diffuse reflection, of course. But we want a glossy reflection or a specular reflection along the eye, and that's where our little eye caps come in. So let's unhide those, Shift H, and come up here and assign a material to both of these. So I'm just going to Shift select them, assign new material, and again I'll use the Nilo material. It really is a very versatile material. Now I'm going to leave the diffuse base on, and this time I'm going to go with weighted layer, and I'm going to go with glossy reflection. Okay, so this weighted layer will now be a glossy reflection. So let's turn that down to 0.1 and quite a sharp highlight we're going to want, so 0.3. That's just to get the little dots in the eye, and then I'm going to add another layer, and I'm going to make this again a weighted layer, and I'm going to make this one a glossy transmission. Now transmission will be transparent, basically it will allow light to transmit through it. So I'll give this a weight of 0.9 and a roughness of pretty much crystal clear, maybe a little 0.1 there. Okay, so now I should be able to see through this when I render, so let's give it a render. Okay, so there's the render. I've got a completely transparent eye cap that's catching some reflections from the environment, but let's have a look at this material, and I would rather the glossy transmission was the underneath layer. So I'm going to put this to 1, I'm going to put this to 0.1, and that should work out a little bit better for us. Now let's take a look at this roughness on here, and let's tone this roughness maybe up a little bit, and let's do our environment. So I'm going to twist the environment so this particularly bright spot is at the front. So I'm going to go like so, and that should give us a better reflection in the eye. Now let's get a good angle for this guy somewhere around here, and I'm going to flick on this just so I can see where the camera would be. Now if you do flick on this film gate and resolution gate, that will allow you to see what you're actually going to render, but it takes up a bit of the screen with all this grayness around it. So I'm going to sort that out by clicking on the camera, going up to display, going to, let's see, where are we? I always lose this one, just a second, it's not, here we go. So display options, and change this overscan to 1.1. There we go. That just gives me a little bit more screen area to work with. Okay, so let's get a render. Okay, now we're talking. That looks much more eye-like. Now I could rotate the background a bit more. Let's just say move it this way a little bit more, and that will change the position of the highlight in the eye. So again, I tend to do this just to check that the eye is working in various different scenarios. If I was going to animate this guy later on, you know, I want to just make sure that I move around the pupil in a nice way. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. If I move this further, obviously the highlight will move more depending on what it's reflecting in the environment, so it should act the same way as a realistic eye would. Okay, there we go, perfect. So there is the material on the eye. Now there are a lot of tweaks that we could make to the material. It renders out fast enough that I'll leave a lot of it for you. I've got a look that I'm pretty happy with at the moment. What I don't want to see is this background. I'm not interested in having him on a blue sky. This background is purely here for provide some lighting, but also to provide some reflection so we can get our nice specular highlights and nice highlights in the eye. I don't actually want to see these treetops. I mean, it doesn't look brilliant. So let's introduce our own background. Now we're going to start with a plane. So I'm just going to put in a polyplane and scale it up. I'm going to move it this way a bit. I'm going to put it by his feet. Now I'm going to leave this plane in the scene, which might sound a bit strange that we'd have two, one on top of the other. But the reason for this is this plane, which will become our backdrop, is going to be invisible to final gather. It's also not going to cast any shadows, because I don't want, when I pull this up to become a background and the light is going from behind, I don't want a big shadow over my character. So I want this to have pretty much no interaction with the lighting. All it's going to do is catch the shadows, and that's it. So we need this original floor plane there to act as a bouncer, because this will be invisible to all bounce light. So we need to leave one in to still have something for the light to bounce off. And let's move this back just a little bit, and now I'm just going to lift it up basically. So let's just go to face mode and select all these faces here. I'm going to lift these up, pull them in a bit this way. I'm not going to be terribly precise about this. And pull them in this way. And just keep going until you've built up sort of a background. Just a plate for him to stand on basically. And you don't need to be too precise. Generally when I'm doing this I would take my time a little bit more than this, but just pull it into sort of shape. And let's just rotate this final one. Okay, close enough, something like that. Now I'm going to hit 3 to smooth and smooth that all out. This gives me a backing plate for him to stand on. Now I'm going to move him, whoops, because I want to move him around, I'm going to just select every mesh that makes up our little chap and hit Ctrl G to group them, and then I can rotate him a little bit to get him a bit more interesting angle and move him forward. So just so his tail is not bisecting that backing plate. And now I'll get my camera in position, and I'm going to do one render without making any changes to this background at all, and show you what I mean when I say we don't want it interfering with the light. So let's come in and let's just snapshot that last render. It's pretty snazzy, and let's do another one. Okay, so there we have it. Now this is not really what we're looking for, and also our light at the moment is coming pretty much straight down from the top, so this is not actually interfering too much at the moment. But if we shot our light from, say, more this angle, then obviously this is going to cast a huge shadow straight across there. So let me show you that. Okay, you'll see now, because this is blocking some of my light, I'm not getting a lot of backlight in here. And this is a problem. This is kind of blocking up all the light. So let's just tweak a few things. Now if we click on the plane itself and come up to the polyplane shape and go under render stats, let's stop it casting any shadows. Let's stop it being visible in reflections or refractions, and let's come down to mental ray, and I don't want it to be visible in the transparency, translucency, I don't want to trace its refraction, I don't want to transmit its refractions, I don't want it to cast final gather rays, and I don't want it to receive final gather rays. So it's just there as a background prop. So let's do another render now we've changed all that lot. Okay, as you can see, with all that lot turned off, and also with the cast shadows turned off and visible in reflections and refractions, what's happened now is we've got our subsurface scattering back, we've got our speck back that's coming around here, but we've also lost the plane completely. But it has done the job. If we flick this backwards, you can see here this is very little subsurface scattering, there's no speck from the direct light. There's all sorts of problems. Well, now we've cured most of those problems, but we've left us with quite a big one that we can't see the background. However, if I turn one of these back on, the final gather receive, you'll see the background comes back, so it's not a problem, and it won't interfere with that speck light or the subsurface scattering. Okay, so now we've fixed the problem of our background, but our light's at a horrible angle because it's coming straight from behind the character. We've got a huge amount of subsurface scattering, and this speck around here, it's too bright, and also it's not very attractive the way that catches the light. So let's start by just making a better path for this light. So let's have it come sort of down and to the side. Maybe a little bit from the back and a little bit downwards. Now normally I'd do several test renders to get that light in the right place, but let's just try it this way. Also that speck was too bright, so let's go into the Mila material and just change the weight of our glossy layer to 0.6. Now I think also that the subsurface scattering might be a nad's wing too high. So I'm going to change the scale conversion from 25 to 30. That should help us out a bit. Let's go back to a camera bookmark. I'm going to grab this guy. I'm going to turn him sideways a bit just so we can show him off a bit better. And I'm going to hit render, and then I'm going to pick out some other problems that may occur, and we're going to sort them out as they pop up. Okay, so here we're looking nice. We've got some nice specular highlights going on around here. This eyebrow is terrific. The eye is nice and highlighted, although it does appear that it's not quite sitting in its socket. So I must have come in at some point and moved that. So let's grab the right eye and the right eye. And, you know, I can just move these back into alignment now. As I say, if I could just grab the right ones, there we go. So I've had a bit of a naming convention failure, and I'm just going to shove that back into alignment. Not quite sure how I knocked that out, but there we go, it happens. Okay, and if I bring up the render, the other thing I noticed is our shadows are a little sharp for this type of render. So I'm going to grab our main light here. I'm going to go into the shape node, and under the shadows I'm going to come down to ray trace shadows. The bigger this light angle is, the more blurred your shadows are going to get, but try not to go mad. I mean, at a value of 5 they'll be extremely blurry. So let's try 2.5 just to get a bit of a blurry edge. Now, when you've got a razor sharp straight edge, you can live with one shadow ray. However, the blurrier it gets, the more of these you'll need to stop it getting grainy. So with a blur of 2.5, I'll go with shadow rays of 32, which will give me a slight grain in my shadow. In fact, if I re-render this whole thing again, now let's just check the rest of this light. So its intensity is okay, its position is not bad, our specular highlights are now coming through quite nicely. Yeah, let's just render and see what we get. Oops, I've just remembered, I think the camera is in the wrong position. It is indeed, so let's use our camera bookmark to go back. There we go. Okay, so you see we're getting some blur in our shadows now, and if you zoom in you can see it's a little grainy. Now, as I've mentioned, you can up the shadow rays and that will smooth out, but for this kind of render that's pretty decent. And the higher this number goes, the higher render time will go as well. So something to be aware of, especially when you're test rendering. Now, I'm quite liking this. Our background, however, is a little undramatic, so let's try and get something in there a bit nicer without doing terribly much. So assign a new material and Mila material, and this time I'm just going to use the diffuse base component, and I'm going to select a ramp. So let's see, we should have a ramp material here somewhere. There we go. And as you can see, black at the bottom, white at the top. So if I move this, the black will go upwards. Now I want a circular ramp, so I'm going to change this to circular, and that gives me black in the middle and white on the outside. I actually want to take that to a different color. Now I'm going to go with a kind of light purple. So I'm going to start off with a very, very light purple. I'm going to put one in the middle and go for a slightly darker purple. Now I picked out some of these colors earlier when I was having a play with different color variations, but you can just use the sliders, of course. and let's go for a kind of desaturated. So I've got a very desaturated purple. You know, you don't want to end up looking too garish. So this should be about fine for me. I'm just going to move him more into the center of the camera. And now with the background, we'll do one final test render. And if he's all good to go, let me just check his material settings. So I'm kind of liking the specularity at the moment. You can have a play around with the roughness and the weight to get more or less, broader specular, broader highlights or sharper highlights, of course. And let's have a look at the scattering. Scale conversion at 30 is nice enough, I think. Again, you'll need to play with the RGB values depending on the color of your character and what sort of scattering you want to get. But for right now, this is looking pretty decent. Let's just try him on a bit more of a dramatic backdrop. Okay, so using that circular ramp has given us a bit more interesting focal point on the middle of the character. Now you might want to tweak the ramp a bit. I think it probably needs to get a bit lighter in the center. So if we go material attributes and we just bring this up this way a bit, that'll lighten us up and maybe make this a bit darker, so we get a more focused hot point. But that's then going to create this ugly gradient. So if we set the interpolation to smooth, that will help that. So that will give us a bit more contrast between the center and the outside of the image. And the last thing to look at is really, this is a 1 minute render, which is pretty decent for a test render, but for a final shot the quality is a little lacking. So I'm going to come up to my settings. I'm going to turn my overall quality to 1, my lighting quality to 1, then I'm going to go down to my legacy options where we have final gather. I'm going to set this to 200, which is a pretty high accuracy, and this to 1. So this will give us a pretty decent amount of accuracy in our indirect illumination for a final render. So I have an overall quality of 1, which will increase the anti-aliasing we're getting amongst other things. I've got the lighting quality cranked up to 1, and I've got the indirect lighting turned up to a much better quality. Now I imagine this render will take about 10 minutes, so I will see you back here when it's finished. Okay, so the damage on the render time wasn't quite as bad as I thought, just 4 minutes and 39 seconds, which is not bad for a completed frame of this size. Now our bump has got a lot sharper, our highlights are better, and the overall quality of the image has gone up quite a bit. Now I'm going to conclude this tutorial here, but you might want to add some extra shadow rays. You might want to change the position of your directional light, you know, just to get it a bit better. You can try front light in the character instead of backlight in it. You know, you can. I would really recommend that you go in as well with the Mila material. Things like the teeth, which at the moment are on a very simple layer, and the spikes on a very simple Mila material with just a diffuse reflection, might benefit from some specular highlight of their own. So go ahead and start adding some layers to your Mila material. But for me, this is pretty much looking like my original shot, slightly different angle, and a slightly different angle on the main light, and my background isn't quite as dominantly purple as this, but again that just comes down to the ramp settings of the color here. So I hope you found this tutorial interesting. We've gone through some Mari, we've gone through some Photoshop, we've gone through some UVing, and now we've gone through a basic way to light up a character and give it a bit of presence. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions, you can always get me on the forum over at simplymaya.com. A lot of very friendly people there who I'm sure will be happy to help, myself included. And if you want to email me directly, you can get me at david@simplymaya.com. So thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next Simply Maya tutorial. Cheers.